Hi, I'm Gemma Manning and this is Business the Hard Way. I'm in studio today and I'm very, very excited because I am joined by a very, very special guest, the one and only Phil Forrest. I think it's fair to say that Phil is an outright legend, and I think it's also fair to say that he's one of Australia's most loved individuals and business figures in Singapore. Phil started his career in Asia with Citi Bank and went on to head up ANZ Asia. And following that, he has been a non-executive director, holding several very impressive directorships of companies in the region, often with a tie back to Australia, including non-executive director of my own company. Phil has also gone on to be a member of several impressive organisations, including the Singapore Institute of Directors, more recently advisor to James Cook University. But to top it all off, he was awarded at the most, or recognised at the most prestigious level for his contribution to the Australia and Singapore commercial relationship, being honoured with a very impressive Order of Australia in 2022 and making the Queen's Honours List. So I don't think anyone could top that off. So I'm very, very lucky and fortunate to have you here today, Phil. A very warm welcome to Business the Hard Way.
Thank you very much, Gemma. Thank you for such a wonderful introduction. And it's great to be with you, and I'm honoured to be part of this podcast series.
Well, thank you, Phil. I was only reflecting on my way here this morning that how lucky am I in that since I've moved back to Sydney, because I used to live in Singapore and enjoyed my time up there, of course, and had you in Singapore, you know, at the same time. So, but I see you more now that I live in Sydney.
I know, it's great.
It is great. I was thinking last week we were in Singapore together, only a week ago.
That's right.
At celebrating my 15 years of business and 10 years in Asia. And now we find ourselves in Sydney this week doing a podcast together.
It's wonderful to be able to keep in such close touch.
It is. So, Phil, I kick off every podcast with a bit of a story for the listeners, because every guest that I have is a special connection with the guest, and each guest is, I would say, part of my tribe. So I wanted to share a little bit about our connection and how we met. So for the listeners, and then please, I'm keen to get your version of events following this, Phil. But we met, I think, over 10 years ago now. So, that's 10 years in itself is a long time to have such a special relationship, business mentorship and friendship. But we met in Singapore, and I think that the night that we met will never leave my memory, Phil. So we were at the Australian High Comms residence, and we were both waiting for taxis. We had been at an event, but I remember we didn't get a chance to talk until we were there waiting for our taxis, and we recognised that we hadn't met yet each other. And so we quickly, only briefly introduced ourselves, exchanged cards, and then I was on my way back to Sydney. And I think, from there we had exchanged emails to properly introduce ourselves, and then I caught up with you the next time I was in Singapore. Now that first lunch meeting that we had in Singapore was such a pivotal moment, in that led to you becoming involved with my business as non-executive director. And I think we unearthed a shared passion for Asia and the region. And I don't share that with many people. So meeting you, having that similar passion for the region and such passion was very inspirational, I would say. So from there, that business lunch, that's led to this mentorship and business relationship we've had for 10 years, where you've been at every milestone in my business history there, or my business journey in Asia, from incorporation, opening offices, going into Perth. Every milestone you've been there, including my own personal milestones, for example, turning 40 in Singapore. You were there emceeing with my beautiful daughter, Amelie. So it's been, a decade plus of milestones, really, and an amazing mentorship and friendship, as I said, that has evolved. So, yeah, you don't get that every day, I would say.
Absolutely, and you are to be congratulated, Gemma, on the success of your Asian journey. It's been a wonderful story. But you're absolutely right. We met at Andrew Robb was the guest of honour.
That's it, sorry.
He was Trade Minister at the time. And you're also right that we only had about 2 minutes to chat before our taxis arrived. What it proves once again is there's no such thing as too much networking.
That's true.
So we both followed up because we'd exchange cards, and that's the way it ought to be.
Yeah. God, if we didn't exchange cards that evening, Phil, I don't know what would have happened.
Well, who knows?
Who knows?
That's
but
right.
Serendipity moment there in that sliding doors, maybe. Yes, that's how it all started. And like I said in my intro, you are one of Australia's most loved individuals in Singapore, and being recognised, at that highest level for your contribution to the Singapore and Australia relationship is, I think you're the only person who's been recognised for that. So having you in my corner, Phil, with being so highly regarded for what you do in Asia has certainly helped my business journey. So I want to say a huge thank you from the bottom of my heart here on the podcast. I say it to you all the time, but I want to have the listeners know that in the spirit of this podcast, Business the Heart Way, it was all about doing things with heart. So I just want to say thank you for everything and for being in my corner, because it has made a difference to my own journey in Asia.
Well, thank you, Gemma, and I thank you too, because it's been such a pleasure and a privilege to be with you on the journey and to witness your success.
Well, the highs and the lows.
May there be many, many more years of that.
I'm sure there will be many highs and lows. But so I'm keen, Phil, we've established how we've met and how we're connected. But I really want to dive a bit deeper into your journey in Asia, because, again, I think that we talk a lot about doing business in Asia, but it's not for everyone, and I think it takes a lot to carve out a successful career or a business in Asia, and you've been in Asia for more than 30 years. It's a very impressive track record.
42 years now.
42, sorry, I said
in Asia, but
33
years in Singapore.
Incredible. Yeah. So can you tell us your story then, Phil? How did you get there, and
Sure.
what does it look like for you?
Yeah. So going back a long, long way, I joined Citi Bank here in Sydney. Yeah. And I think at that time, possibly still, but at that time, Citi Bank was probably the most multinational company in the world. They had more flags in the map than any other company. And I started to realize that opened a world of opportunity for me. And on April Fool's Day 1980, I was sent off to Sri Lanka for 2 months. So that was my first mini posting. But then from there, I went straight to New York for 2 years, head office New York, of course. And then that's when I really got lucky, because Citibank, being everywhere, could have sent me to Europe or Latin America or Africa or the Middle East. But I got Southeast Asia, and I think that was the luckiest break of my life, and I've come to love that region. I find it so exciting and vibrant, and just a wonderful place to be. So I was sent first to Manila, then to Jakarta, then to Bangkok, and as I mentioned earlier, I've been in Singapore now for 33 years. Something that's probably worth mentioning is, as an expat in these countries, as an Aussie expat, you're expected to join the Australian Chamber of Commerce, other chambers, and so forth. And I did that, and then I became a little more involved with committee work and so forth, and board work. And then I was late for a committee meeting once and found I'd been made president in my absence. So that gave me a taste for governance, for the idea of sitting around a board table making decisions for the team then to carry out. And I think really that was the beginning of my journey into a portfolio career, ultimately, where instead of working for the one big bank or the one big company, you hopefully can bring some experience to a number of different organizations. So that's where I am today. I think you mentioned the Singapore Institute of Directors. That's been a huge opportunity for me to make a contribution, I think, but also to meet so many high-powered Singaporeans and others to make a lot of friends at that level, and to learn a lot more about the highs and lows of being a company director.
Yes, no, it's very very impressive, the journey, and I think that's a significant amount of time to spend in the region. So there's obviously a love of it. Can you share a little bit more about that love and passion for particularly Singapore? I mean, you're there 33 years. A lot of people come and go. You're there and you're solid there, and there's obviously a real spark for Singapore. What is that,
Well, it's easy to keep up the passion for a place like Singapore because it is so exciting.
Yes.
And of course it's evolved, and the whole of Asia has evolved since I arrived. To be honest, when I arrived in Manila, first Asian posting, in 1982, no one was talking about the Asian century. Couple of countries, Singapore and Hong Kong, were doing okay, but they were small. China was still in turmoil. Japan was still recovering from the Second World War. Vietnam, of course, was recovering from its more recent war. And countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, etc., were really not doing any better than other parts of the world. That has now changed so dramatically, and I don't think anyone questions now that this is the Asian century. And the good news is it's only 2024, so we've got another 76 years to enjoy it. But coming back to Singapore, I can remember 30 years ago, the Western media was very often quite critical of Singapore as being authoritarian, non-democratic, etc., and probably with some justification. But you don't get that today, and the world beats a path to Singapore. London says it wants to be Singapore on the Thames. China comes to Singapore to ask for advice on financial management. The United States comes to Singapore to ask for advice on what's happening in the region. And Singapore is becoming less authoritarian and more of a kinder, gentler society. So lots to enjoy, enjoying that transition, and still lots to discover.
Yeah.
So it's not difficult to keep up the enthusiasm.
No. I mean, they're such interesting insights, because I think in my experience of Singapore, I mean, I first started doing business there probably more than 20 years ago when I was working for corporate, and I had an Asia Pac role, and then, in my own business, obviously wanted to keep my passion for Asia alive, and was probably determined to find some business opportunity just to be able to do it, which is kind of what's happened. But even in those years, I've seen that significant change or significant change from a business perspective. And I think what drew me to Singapore was that, being the Silicon Valley of the East, and, this entrepreneurial innovation, hub that Singapore was coming 10 years ago. But what I find interesting, Phil, and I'm keen to get some comments from you while we're talking about Asia, Southeast Asia in particular, and where it's at today, is, you're right. It is its time for the Asia region, and the world is looking at Southeast Asia more and more so. So what we have is, even earlier this month, we had the ASEAN Australia Summit in Melbourne, just very, very recently. And obviously a lot of discussion and dialogue, again, in Australia about those untapped opportunities, or why we should be looking towards Southeast Asia.
Sure.
Do you...
Well, I mean, there are some success stories of Australian companies, and you're one of them in that region. But I wish there were a lot more.
Yeah.
I wish there was more understanding in Australia of the opportunities that are on their doorstep. Southeast Asia is pretty close.
Yeah.
The middle class in Southeast Asia is growing at a faster rate than anywhere else in the world. And that's expected to continue for at least the next 30 or 40 years. So, and these aren't my numbers. This is the World Bank and the IMF both say that. I don't think. Well, I think that Southeast Asia is the sweet spot of the global economy for the next 2 or 3 decades. A couple of other countries are interesting as well. India is doing well and probably will continue to. Perhaps parts of the Middle East, Dubai, I think, is one to watch. But to me, the ASEAN countries, excluding Myanmar for obvious reasons, is where the opportunities lie, because people are getting richer.
Yeah.
And what do people want when they get richer? They want better quality goods. They want better food.
Yeah.
We saw in China where as they had their wave of prosperity and 600 million people got dragged out of poverty into the middle class, probably the best news story of the last 100 years in a way. And now it's Southeast Asia's turn.
Yeah.
But in China, people now eat close to 10 times as much meat as they used to 25 years ago. Yeah. And the same thing is happening in countries like Vietnam and Thailand and Indonesia and so forth. They want better goods of all kind. They want better wine. These are all things that Australia does pretty well. Yeah. They need financial services. They want advice. They want tourist destinations. They want university education for their kids. And they have a desperate need for huge expenditure on infrastructure. The numbers for the next 30 years vary between $1 trillion worth and $7 trillion worth, whatever it is. It's a big number. And maybe we can't build all that infrastructure, but we can provide engineers and architects and minerals and so forth that are required for it. So huge opportunities. And in spite of all that, and the 650 million people who are getting richer, we still invest more in New Zealand every year than we do in the 10 countries of Southeast Asia. So I would like to see that change. But you mentioned the ASEAN Summit, and I think that's terrific. And it allows me to pay a compliment to government in Australia, because I think government is doing a good job of trying to build the awareness of this opportunity.
Yeah.
Through the diplomatic posts, through Austrade and the various state government trade offices, through negotiating free trade agreements, and generally through good diplomatic work. And the current government has put aside billions of dollars to support business opportunities into Southeast Asia. So I think that's great.
Yeah,
and as I mentioned, there are some good success stories. Lend-Lease is a favourite of mine. They've been building housing in Singapore since the 1970s. And there are a number of others as well. But it'd be wonderful if there were a lot more.
Which I want to explore more of that with you, Phil, because, I think you hit a really interesting point around education, because I agree that I think with the ASEAN Australia Summit more recently and the government initiatives, there is, people are trying to build awareness here in Australia of Southeast Asia, and I think there's a lot more work to be done.
Yeah.
For me, it was interesting when I, I guess my journey was from Australia to Singapore first. And then from Singapore, I got to understand much more about the region.
Yep.
And it was only being in Singapore and anchored there that I then understood or was exposed more to Indonesia. And I don't think I would have ever set up my entities or employed staff in Indonesia if I was coming at it purely from an Australian perspective. It was more being in Singapore and being there surrounded by the region that did it make much more sense to also be in Indonesia, and could I figure out how to do that? So I think that, the opportunities are there, and there is a pathway there, and there is a way of tackling it. It's just there's not the awareness. People or companies don't quite know how to tackle it, how to navigate it. Where do you start? Are the risks too high? I mean, there's all sorts of reasons that I think that's why more companies aren't probably doing it, but they should. Yep. As you said, you've got James Cook University, you've got Lend-Lease, you've got some very impressive Australian organisations who have done it.
Yes.
But my question to you is, what is the secret sauce? I mean, and this I think can be not just how to do business in Asia, but how to build a career in that, if it was easy, maybe more people would be doing it and being successful at it or having longevity in the region. So from your perspective, and I've obviously got my views, but what do you see as a secret sauce to doing it in Southeast Asia?
Okay, well, before I have a go at that, I'll just pick up on your point about how you came to Singapore and then went into other parts of the region, notably Indonesia. And I think that's a very sensible, very intelligent way to do it. I think for those Australian companies that feel that they want a toe in the water to test the temperature and then expand from there if things work out, Singapore is the obvious place. It's not the cheapest place, but it is the safest. It's the most dependable and reliable, and it is the hub of Southeast Asia. As for what works in Asia, probably what I'm about to say would apply to most regions in the world. But I think, first point is show respect to everybody. If you come in and show respect to the CEO that you're meeting, but you're dismissive to the receptionist, people will know. Yeah. People will notice. So respect to everyone. No sense of superiority. No sense of condescension. Yeah. And as Aussies, I think we have been guilty of a little bit of that in the past, so that's something to watch. Recognizing that cultures can be different, but they're not right or wrong, they're just different. And it's often said to me that that Australia is the most different culture from most of Asia in the world, even more different than the Americans.
Wow. That's something.
So I don't know if that's true or not, but we are quite different. We're very egalitarian. We think everybody should be the same level.
Yeah.
Well, much of Asia doesn't see it that
way.
And we need to respect that. We can be very direct and blunt with our words, our conversation. And in some parts of Asia, that's seen as a little bit rude, a little bit off-putting. So it's not going to build the sort of relationships that you want. Yeah. We tend, as Aussies, to think that individual rights are paramount. Many communities, particularly those who have been through civil wars and so forth, say no, peace and harmony is more important than the fact that you can say what you like. Yeah. So when you're on our turf, you can't necessarily say what you like. So not wrong, just different.
Yeah.
And we need to embrace the differences, I think, to be successful. Recognizing too that relationship is everything. Don't try to sell until you've earned the right.
Yeah.
In other words, until you've developed relationships, friendships, and so forth. It takes time.
It does take time.
Yeah, but I think people who do come in with that kind of frame of mind, being prepared to adjust their behaviour a little bit, there's no reason why they shouldn't succeed in Asia. Another point I would make, of course, is that there's no such thing as the Asian culture, or even within individual countries, cultures differ dramatically. South Vietnam is quite different from North Vietnam in those terms. Jakarta is different from Jogjakarta, and so it goes. But to the extent that we can generalize, I think there is more of a placing importance on long-term relationships and things of that nature rather than the quick sale.
Totally. And I think when we've spoken about this over the years too, and I think that's why we always got along so well, is sharing those values ourselves as
Yeah.
individuals and as business figures around respect, being humble. And I think for me personally, living in Japan as an 18-year-old and having that exposure, I kind of had that grooming and cultural empathy and intelligence maybe from a younger age, having lived abroad and learning a language and respecting culture, which I guess for me is what I brought into my business journey there in Singapore, is that sense of respecting the country you're in, understanding it, taking time to understand, appreciate, all those things that you've spoken about. And I think the other thing probably that's just to reiterate, and I see this a lot with companies not giving it time, is the fact that patience and perseverance is absolutely key, and that things won't happen overnight, but they do happen. So I think that sense of the opportunity is there for sure for Australian companies, but also for, Southeast Asia, as we've spoken about, is on the world stage now. It's got attention, whether it's from Europe or from the US, not just from Australia.
Absolutely.
But I think as Aussies, we really need to embrace and take the opportunities because it's on our doorstep.
It is on our doorstep, and also Asians tend to like Aussies in spite of everything. So the welcome mat is there.
It is.
They're not pleading with us to come because the Europeans and the Americans and everybody else are keeping them busy. But we're welcome when we show up.
There's absolutely a high regard and respect for sure for Australians, Australian companies, Australian brands, the quality, the kind of services we can provide. And I think the other thing I just want to also touch on here, Phil, is because I think what inspires me from looking at your journey there in Asia is that you have embedded yourself in the local business ecosystem as much as, a very well-respected member of the Australian business community. You haven't limited yourself to just the Australian business community. You're highly respected in the Singapore business community. You've spoken about the Singapore Institute of Company Directors. You're firmly there with the local business community, giving back and supporting, which I think is a hugely important thing for longevity in the region, is to really care about the community and be part of it. Do you have any comments about that?
Well, yeah, I think one of the great things about Singapore, and I admire them so much for this, is that it's such a cosmopolitan city that it welcomes the involvement of anybody who wants to be involved. So Singapore Institute of Directors welcomed me once I showed enthusiasm for the idea of contributing. I was on the board for 9 years and probably still would be, except that there's a 9-year term limit, which I think is a very sensible thing. So I was welcomed onto that. I sat on the council of the Singapore Business Federation for 6 years, again as one of the very few non-Singaporeans, but made to feel very welcome. I was on the board, the council of the Association of Banks in Singapore. Lots of opportunities to make a contribution if you wish to do so. And the great thing about getting involved with those sorts of organizations is you meet so many wonderful people. So there can be a lot of work involved, but the payoff is, and of course you don't get paid in a monetary sense, but the psychic income is amazing.
I think that's something for companies coming up into the region to also consider. If they're lucky to, if a founder or CEO is lucky to be based there in Singapore, is being really part of the community. I think that kind of comes back to respect and some of those values that we spoke about.
I
before.
agree. It's very easy to go up as an expat and remain an expat and come back as an expat without really getting immersed in what's going on. And so I chose Singapore Institute of Directors because I thought it would be a great opportunity to learn and to expand my network, and that worked well. I also chose the Australian Alumni Singapore. Do you know there are about 240,000 Singaporeans who have been to an Australian university?
It's quite some statistic, isn't it?
So the association that embraces them.
Yeah.
I joined because I felt I'd meet a lot of Singaporeans who felt good about Australia.
Yeah.
And that's the case. So I've been on their council for, I think, about 10 years now.
And you received a Lifetime Achievement Award.
I did, which was very generous of them.
Yeah.
And of course, I've been involved with the Australian Chamber of Commerce as well, but that is, and I think that's important,
Yeah.
but that is only one aspect of life in a foreign country.
Absolutely agree.
Yeah.
So Phil, I think what we're just discussing here is how you have done business with heart in Asia. You really have. You've been such a good role model for me to look to. And again, I don't find so many people that do business with heart. And in another country where, I think you kind of, to make it in a foreign country that's not your home country, it does require even more heart. You need to be genuine, you need to be committed, you need to be passionate. You need to care about the place to be there and commit and invest for so long. So with the theme of business with heart, what does that mean to you, Phil?
Okay, well, first of all, I congratulate you on coming up with that as the theme for this podcast series. I think that's a wonderful title. And I thought about what does that mean? I think it could be interpreted in a number of different ways. Perhaps having a purpose to your life so that you're happy to wake up every morning and think it's another day to get on with life, and feeling engaged with people, engaged with doing something that's relatively worthwhile. That is one aspect of business with heart, I think, and it's important as you get older, and I can tell you something about that. It's important that we don't lose that sense of engagement. But I think another way of looking at business with heart is probably the way that you manage people or lead people. I suppose occasionally there is a need for Old Testament discipline in a leadership role, but I don't think that showing anger is a sustainable leadership trait.
Yeah.
And I think much more important is leadership through encouragement, support, mentoring, clarity, providing clarity of goals and so forth. And perhaps the most important part of all is a focus not on your own success, but on the success of the people that you're responsible for, the people around you, maybe even broader than that, the success of the community or whatever. And the way I like to wrap it all up is to suggest that it's managing with a generosity of spirit. So I don't know if that's what you had in mind when you came up with the term, but I think if you, well, in my case at least, if you can enjoy the work that you're doing and get satisfaction from that, and if you can help some of the people around you more often than you don't, and if you feel that you can make a contribution, whether it's to society or individuals or even looking after your dog, whatever it is, then that to me comes back to my sense of business with heart. Yeah,
no, absolutely. No, it means different things to different people, but I think that kind of is, it's a nice way to kind of summarise your thoughts on business the heart way. What do you, right now in your career, what do you care about most when it comes to business?
Okay, at my age, I'm allowed to be a little bit more frivolous, perhaps, than than I might have been 30 years ago. But this point actually is not at all frivolous. It's just something that I've become rather involved with, and that is being a supporter of diversity on boards, gender diversity on boards in particular, although diversity encompasses other aspects as well. But we have a bit of a problem in Asia. The proportion of women on boards, public company boards, is not what it should be, and it's not in Singapore. And this disturbs me because Singapore is so good at almost everything, but for some reason, not even as good as Australia. Actually, Australia's doing pretty well.
Is that right? Do you have some stats to share? Sorry.
Yeah. So there are about 670 companies on the Singapore Stock Exchange, and about just over 15% of the directors are female. That compares with, I think, about 25% in Australia. And if you look at the top companies in Australia, it's nudging towards 40%, which is great. Yeah. But let's talk about the whole market.
Yeah.
Singapore should be doing better, particularly when you think of the fact that according to a Deloitte study about 6 months ago, Singapore has the highest proportion of female CEOs in the developed world.
Wow.
Now, it's 13%, which doesn't sound very high, but it's the highest in the developed world.
That's incredible.
So you would think the natural follow-on from that would be more women on boards.
That's right.
And there are so many talented, smart women in Singapore that I meet every day and think, why aren't these people getting onto boards? It's changing. It's 15% now. 12 years ago, it was 6%. So that's some level of momentum. But most of the rest of the developed world is doing better.
So can I ask you what needs to change then for that number to increase in Singapore?
I think, I conducted moderated a panel discussion last Friday, which, as you will know, was International Women's Day. And our panel, I was the moderator because somebody had to exercise that Old Testament discipline. But the panel was female. But as I explained, they weren't there because they were female. They were there because they're experts in the field of governance. Yeah. It just happened to be International Women's Day as well. We conducted a poll of the audience, and the audience were directors in Singapore. Do you think it's time that we stopped mucking about and had quotas in the same way that Norway did 20 years ago? All the Scandinavian countries followed. Then France and most of Europe followed. California has followed. Australia hasn't. But is it time, given the lack of progress or the slow progress in Singapore, that we did something similar? And there was an overwhelming vote for yes, it is time, which surprised me a little bit because that wouldn't have been the result just a few years ago. There were all these concerns about, you get tokenism. Women feel that they're only there because they're a woman.
Because it's interesting. I remember being at a round table a few years ago with Julie Bishop.
Julie Bishop, right.
And the conversation was around this.
Yeah.
But everybody was like, no, against quotas actually. Well, a large part of the participants in a round table. So it's interesting then what you're saying is it's shifted, which is good.
Yeah.
So
I think people are just getting a bit fed up at the pace.
Okay.
Now, an interesting thing has happened. The stock exchange has now brought in a hard rule that after 9 years, you can no longer be considered independent. Okay. You can stay on the board, but you're no longer an independent director. And this is relevant because there's another rule that says at least half the board has to be independent. And if the chair is not independent, then a majority have to be independent. So if you keep somebody on who is no longer independent, was before but is no longer, means you've got to bring in 2 more people to balance that.
Right.
So boards get bigger, or for whatever reason, about 400 new directors will be required during this year, 2024.
Really? Okay.
And that's going to create a lot of opportunities, not all for women, but hopefully a lot.
Are there that number of directors there in Singapore, or, like when you're looking through SID?
Yeah, I don't think there's a problem with pipeline.
Yeah.
I think the talent is there. The experience in some cases is there, but in other cases it will come. I think if companies are serious about board diversity, they will find the people they want.
Yeah.
They might have to, companies could do more about bringing women perhaps in the executive ranks to board meetings to observe for 6 months and then make a judgment about whether they want to put them on the board. There are things that we could be doing that I think we do need to keep hammering away at.
Absolutely. And are you still involved? I know you're not with the Singapore Institute of Company Directors in a member capacity or the capacity before,
I'm still on several committees.
Okay, so you're kind of helping drive that change?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I would hope that that's for others to say, but I would hope that others would say that I make my contribution.
Yeah. Well, that's very good to hear, Phil, because I think, I'm very passionate, obviously, about a level playing field and also more female representation.
I do it for two reasons. One is it's only fair. Why would you ignore half the population? Yeah. The other is I think it'll be better for business, better for companies, better for governance in Singapore. Yeah. So it's a no-brainer for me.
Yeah.
I'm not doing it because I'm a nice guy. I'm doing it because it's right.
Yeah, makes sense. Phil, we've covered a lot of ground, but I'm keen to also explore the highs and lows, though, because I know we've had a very positive conversation there, but also I know through my own journey trying to build something in another country, of course there's going to be some highs and lows, but from your experience, do you want to share with us your highs and lows over this period?
I have trouble pointing to any lows.
Thought you would say that, Phil.
I'd like to think I'm a moderately upbeat sort of a guy.
You are very upbeat, optimistic, positive, which is great. Always lifting.
But there's always the case where you lose the deal and that sort of thing. But if you mean on the high side, if you mean what are the things that have brought me satisfaction?
Yeah.
I think I would say it has mostly been in this field of pro bono, not-for-profit organisations. You mentioned James Cook University. I've enjoyed and learned so much by being on their advisory board. I've learned so much from the Singapore Institute of Directors and met so many great people. Same with the Australian Alumni Singapore. I get great personal ego boost from lecturing at National University of Singapore, the number 8 ranked university in the world.
So what are you lecturing there?
About
business,
governance and the role of the board,
Great.
So these sorts of things, never going to make me rich, except in a psychic sense.
Yeah.
And that's what I enjoy. But I enjoy the board work that I get paid for as well. And thank you for making me part of that. But really very very difficult to come up with a time where I thought I got to get out of here. Hasn't happened yet. May happen soon.
I can't imagine it happening for you, Phil. Let's talk, though, about the Order of Australia.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty remarkable high, I'm sure, and ultimate recognition.
I think it's remarkable.
If anybody deserved that recognition, it's you, Phil. But,
Thank you.
But what an achievement, the most, prestigious award, and you couldn't get more highly recognised for your contributions to the Australian-Singapore relationship.
I was very, very chuffed. I was delighted to get it. And I think anyone who does get that kind of award goes through some very serious imposter syndrome. And it's very easy to look around and think, well, a lot of these other people deserve that too, or deserve it more. But I can live with that. But yes, I was delighted. The citation was for I think it said superior contribution to the Singapore-Australia business relationship.
Yeah.
And I think, well, if I was ever going to get an award for anything in my life, that'd be just about perfect for satisfying me. So I was very happy, and I was very happy that you came up from Sydney to Singapore for the day I received the award.
It was a highlight, like being there. I'm so honoured to have been there.
And
but
are
quite
you
incredible.
aware that the Queen died later that night?
I know. That's what gives me goosebumps thinking about Phil. I just remember waking up the next morning to think, my gosh, is this really... Given that you were like on the last Queen's Honours list, really, in
yes,
her
that's right.
reign.
That's
so
right.
that's quite... I was so honoured to be there and to see you, because I know to see you receive that. But again, if I think of anybody who deserves that, and the contribution you have made to the Australia-Singapore relationship, Phil, you are the original, I think, in this space. There's people like myself who have come into Asia to do business in the last little while, but you've seen this region develop. You've been committed to it, and I think on behalf of all of us, it's to thank you for doing business with heart in Asia. I think you are inspirational.
Thank you very much, Gemma. That's very, very kind.
Last question for you, Phil.
Yeah.
So, what would be your advice to people, business leaders or businesses going into Asia? Now, we've touched on a couple of things in terms of secret sauce and lessons and tips, but any final words that you have for our listeners?
Yes, I think, don't just assume that you can make a 2-day trip to Singapore and you've mastered Asia. Recognize that it's a long learning progress, and building relationships takes time. Particularly building relationships which you hope will become partnerships. Become informed on developments in the region, which means really, really paying attention. Listen more than you talk. Always a good rule anywhere in the world, I think. We mentioned modesty. We mentioned humility. I think not to be understated. They're very important. Arrogance is a huge turn-off in that part of the world. And if I can go back to words I used earlier, Asians like Australians, but Asians respond well to generosity of spirit. Yeah. So I think people who go with that frame of mind and with a sensible strategy and with some funding and whatever it takes, but people with that frame of mind, I think, will do well in that part of the world.
Hear, hear. 100% agree, Phil. So it has been an absolute pleasure to have you here today, Phil. So thank you so much for joining me here in Sydney. It's been an honour to have you in person versus doing this virtually. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gemma. Really enjoyed it. Wonderful to be with you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.